Hey everybody, Reagan Archibald here. Welcome back. So honored to have you on this program. My purpose is to end chronic disease. I'd love to live in a world where chronic disease was optional for people who chose to end their chronic disease. And I believe one of the most critical things that we have to address in the very beginning of anyone's health program or anybody's health cycle is blood sugar. Now, you guys know my story. I had a rude awakening not long ago about my own blood sugar. And so I realized I've got to start diving in deeper. And so today we're jumping into training number 3. But before we do this, I want to make sure that you've got your circadian rhythm set up because once again, we can put in time restricted eating, but if you're not doing those other things like getting out in the sun in the morning, doing a meditation in the evening, making sure an hour before bed you're really setting your clock so that you're dimming your lights. There's no blue lights in front of you. You got your blue light blocking glasses, looking really trendy and hip in those. But make sure you're doing all these things to get back in the rhythms of the earth. We've far removed ourselves from this idea that we need to be synchronized with the seasons and synchronized with the earth, but now we're finally coming back to that. This wisdom of the ages is now backed by science, and so suddenly we take some stock in it. But today, I think this next training could be the most transformative part of your entire health. So this is where we talk about time restricted eating. Now, I'm just going to go through and give you a brief overview of how blood sugar works. So, if you have low blood glucose, what happens is your pancreas releases glucagon by the alpha cells. This glucagon goes into the liver, and the liver converts it into glucose and releases glucose into the blood, and then you have normal blood. So, that's if you have low blood glucose or blood sugar. High blood sugar is what happens is the beta cells in your pancreas, they release insulin. And what happens is when insulin gets released, the fat cells take in glucose from the blood. And then that's one way that you can achieve normal glucose levels. So ideally, we don't want this process. We want to overcome this whole process so that when sugar gets secreted or you eat sugar, it gets in your blood, the cells use the sugar as energy. If you bypass that, if you have too low a blood sugar or too high, it's going to affect either your liver and your pancreas, or it's going to affect your adipose tissue or your fat cells and your pancreas. And so I know if you're like me, you do not want to put on weight. You like staying lean and being shredded and feeling great. And so we want to transform your blood sugar so that you're not putting glucose into the fat cells because that's just going to create more fat cells. So one of the research that I think could really help us is this study. They took mice for a 4.5 month period of time, and these mice were on a high fat diet and also high sugar, and they tested it with time restriction. And what they found is that it did not matter what or how much these mice ate, but it was when they eat, which was so critical. So these mice, they ate the same food, but the ones who were on the time restriction at the end of this 4.5 month study, they had 28% less body mass and 70% less fat. Here's an image of this study, but you can see that the group that had the 24-hour feeding cycle had 18 grams of body fat, whereas the group of mice that had only an 8-hour feeding cycle, just 4 grams of body fat. So the 24-hour per day mice had 4 times more body fat, even though they ate the same amount of calories, the same exact diet. So there's another study where they took obese mice, and they wanted to know, well, if we took obese mice and they could eat the same diet but for 24 hours a day, would they become even more obese? And that's what they found. They become morbidly obese mice after having this 24-hour cycle. And then they took these obese mice and they said, well, let's try time restricted. So they only allowed these mice to eat for 8 hours, and those obese mice became fit mice. Then they took another group and they said, okay, let's take lean mice and let's feed them this diet of fats and sugars, and let's give these lean mice this 24-hour cycle and see what happens. And after 4.5 months, these lean mice were obese mice, of course. And then they took the lean mice and they said, well, we're going to put them on a time-restricted diet. And what they found is on the time-restricted diet, these lean mice became fit and more muscular. And then they took another group. They said, okay, we're going to do lean mice. And what we're going to have is we're going to give these lean mice time restriction just 5 days out of the week. And on the weekend, these lean mice are going to be able to have a 24-hour cycle where they can eat whatever they want, whenever they want. Not whatever, but the same diet, but it was just whenever they wanted on the weekends. And sure enough, what they found is these lean mice actually, from doing time restricted only 5 days a week, they became fit mice. They become more muscular and had better endurance. And so I think that's where we look at it and we say, well, your time restriction, you can be a little more lenient on the weekends and still get the benefits from this time restricted eating. So hopefully that's some good news for you who love being social. But some of the things that we found is restricting for 8 to 9 hours is probably even more beneficial. The very first place that we start at is on a 12-hour cycle. So let's say you ate breakfast at 7 this morning. The very last food that touches your mouth needs to be at 7 o'clock tonight. So that's where you start, where it's 12 hours. But if you even can restrict it more to an 8 to 9 hour feeding period, it will increase your endurance. And you'll also note that there's going to be an increase in brown fat tissue. Now, brown fat is what our body can use as energy much easier than the white fat. There's also going to be an increase in your mitochondria activity, so your bacteria are going to communicate better with your cells, and your cells are going to produce more energy for you when you restrict it down to 8 to 9 hours. So restricted feeding, what's important about this is it helps your DNA repair. So we talk about stem cells a lot and stem cell turnover, stem cell proliferation, and restricting your time that you eat is one of the best ways to regenerate your cells and regenerate your body in a very healthy way. A lot of those rogue cells, it's called apoptosis, some of those cells that are starting to get sickly and not perform as well, they'll die off quicker as well when you're doing this time-restricted eating. Time-restricted eating is also important for building your immune system, helps repair your bodily tissues. So one of the best things that you can do is you can just make a goal right now and say, okay, let me start at 12 hours a day where I'm not eating anything. And when I say not eating anything, there's a difference between intermittent fasting and a difference between ketosis, and there's a difference between time-restricted eating. And time-restricted eating is where I see the best clinical outcomes for blood sugar. And what this means is you're not eating anything that causes a metabolic reaction in your body. Some people think, I'm going to be on a fast, and they're doing tea, coffee, because those things have no calories in them. But I want you to avoid even the tea and the coffee, even taking your supplements, your herbs. Those things, those are going to create an activity in your liver, and so they're going to elicit a metabolic response. So only water. And if you want to put a little bit of sea salt in water, that's fine, because the minerals are neutral. There's no vitamins with them that are going to elicit a metabolic response. But sometimes a little sea salt in the water is a little trick I've learned so that I don't get hungry. And so if you look at this, if you can go 15 hours, that's even better. But then if you go 15 hours without eating, you got a 9-hour time period to eat. And so it's something you really have to, manage. So here's some options for you. One option is you go 12 o'clock 12 noon, you eat lunch, you eat a good healthy lunch, and you stop eating at 8 p.m. A lot of my clients, a lot of my patients, this is the process that they love the best. It works for them, and maybe do that. I try to do that about 3 times a week, and it works really well for me. I can't do it every day of the week. It's just not sustainable for me. And so you can break this up. But even doing this a couple times a week, you'll feel very empowered, very clear mentally. but you've got to be prepared for it. This is the time restricted eating that the Wolverine does. You guys all know Hugh Jackman, so I'm going to give you the challenge. You want to be ripped like Hugh Jackman? Well, here's what you can do. So here's another process where you have 5 days of the week. Remember the mice that only did the time restricted eating? They were just lean mice. They weren't fit. These lean mice that did 5 days of time restricted eating, eating the same food as they had before, they became fit and shredded, lean, fit mice. So this is your 5 and 2. So maybe on Sunday you eat 8 to 8. That's your time restricted eating. And then, or that's your weekend eating, or your time restricted there. You go to Monday and you only eat from 8 p.m. to 12 a.m. You just eat in the morning, and everything else is blocked out. You go Tuesday and you pretty much give yourself the full day. You go Wednesday and you've got a block from 8 to 8. So you're on your time restricted eating. Wednesday, you really compress it down where you're only eating a few hours out of the day, and then you've got more flexibility on the Friday and the Saturday. So there's some things you can do there. You can do alternate days where, let's say, Sunday you're eating a certain way. You're eating like from 8 to 8. And then maybe Monday becomes more of a fasting day. Then Tuesday, it's more 8 to 8. Wednesday, fasting. Thursday, 8 to 8. Friday, fasting. Saturday, eat all day. So there's things that you can do to incorporate this in your life. I don't want this to be a challenge to you, but I do encourage you to start looking at the time you eat. The times that I do best in is I found that eating from about 9 o'clock to 6 o'clock is very realistic for me. Sometimes it's like that 8:30, and I try to finish eating by 5:30, so it's more of like this 9-hour process. But I find that it's much easier if you plan in advance and you say, okay, we're going to be eating dinner at 5 o'clock every single night, and that means you can get, and many of you say, oh, my work doesn't allow me to do that. Well, on weekends, you can certainly shift into this mode. But if your work doesn't allow that, then you're going to have to eat your breakfast later in the day. Maybe you don't eat breakfast until 10 o'clock, and you take that first break at work, and that's when you eat your breakfast. So be very strategic about this. But like I said, in mine, I personally like to do right around 9 to about 6. That's a perfect schedule for me where I don't feel super hungry. It doesn't affect me as much. Of course, I start to get hungry right around like 8:30 because I typically will wake up around 5, sometimes in the morning. Sometimes at night, I'll get a little hunger pain. So that's where, I notice that I got to drink more water. And putting a little sea salt in my water at night, it negates that desire to eat, come 8 o'clock. So here's some things. We've noted that you're going to have this increased endurance, the mitochondrial activity. The other fasting benefits that you're going to have is you're going to have a decrease of fat buildup. You're going to have a decrease of glucose intolerance. That means your blood sugar is going to be more stable. And this is what they found in the mice who did the 24-hour feeding versus the time restricted. You're going to have a decrease of leptin resistance. And we're going to jump into exactly what leptin resistance is. But leptin is your appetite hormone. And so you do not want that elevated because you're going to be hungry all the time. So the other thing is it decreases liver pathology, it decreases inflammation, and it increases motor coordination. So good time to do your workout is when you're fasting. So with this fasting benefit, what they did is they took 100 people, another study, and they took them through a series of 30-day cycles of periodic fasting, each with 25 days of unrestricted eating and 5 days of restricted eating. So this was just 5 days out of 30. And here's the interesting thing. After only 3 cycles, those subjects who started the trial with high blood sugar saw big improvements. None of the subjects in the trial experienced any harmful effects. So that was only 5 days. So for those of you who are like, man, Reagan, this sounds so extreme, all I want you to do then is try it for 5 days out of the month. That's like 1 day a week. I mean, anybody can do that. Here's another interesting thing about stem cells is a fasting state to feeding state triggers stem cell regeneration and growth. So when you let your digestive system fully relax, you've got stem cells, massive amounts in these crypts in the villi of your small intestine. And these are primarily stem cells that are called CD34. You've got some LGR5 stem cells down there as well. And these stem cells help regulate your endothelial cells in your intestines so you can absorb more nutrients. But what happens is when you fast, those cells, those stem cells, get reactivated right when you eat. And then they regenerate. So those stem cells come out of this quiescent state where they're just sitting there kind of quiet and waiting, and then it triggers them into action. So the more stem cells you have, the more your body can heal. So pretty fascinating. Here's some other interesting things. Fruit flies. One of the things the researchers do is they study fruit flies because their heart has similar genes and diseases as humans, believe it or not, as annoying as those little things are. So what they found is that by following a time-restricted diet, they wanted to find out, did they develop a heart problem later? And they found that not only did they sleep better, but they were more energetic. They didn't have heart problems in the future. The mitochondria in their heart cells were healthier. The electron transport chain was more effective. It also showed better proteostasis, which is important for protein folding. So they didn't have the diseases that came. So the other thing is when you have a time-restricted eating, it links your microbiota to your microbiota and digestion, because your vagus nerve, which extends from your brain, it's the wandering nerve, it's the longest nerve in your body. This vagus nerve connects with your intestines. And so your microbiota, you have certain microbiota that are asleep at night just like you are, and then they're awake during the day when you're eating. And so these microbiota follow a circadian clock. And so different bacteria are active during different parts of the day. So when you fast and when you have regular fasting between meals even, then what that does is it allows a vast variety of species to grow. So for those of you who have...
If you've had your stool tested, like I mentioned in section 1 and training number 1, then you'll know that there's a lot of different species that need to be balanced. You may have parasitic overgrowths. You may have certain imbalances between your Firmicutes and Bacteroides. You may also find that you've got small intestine bacterial overgrowth. But all these things can be regulated through watching your circadian rhythms and making sure that you're doing some type of time-restricted eating, and then not grazing all day long. There's this weird notion that the only way you can balance your blood sugar is by eating small meals all throughout the day. And that is as far from the truth as we've found. Maybe in the beginning you're going to have to give yourself a little space, but maybe instead of eating every hour, you say, okay, I'm going to eat every hour and 15 minutes, and then slowly just start squeezing in time so that your body has a chance to heal. Because I find that if you follow the recommendations that are out there for reversing blood sugar issues, you're going to stay in a deeper state of this chronic inflammatory cycle, which leads to more diabetes and harder times correcting the actual root cause. So regularity of fasting, what happens? You get a variety of species, like I mentioned. The time-restricted changes the way that sugars are digested. So it's very interesting because you'll actually use those sugars in the cell instead of being hungry all the time. It can also decrease our cholesterol level and increase the production of bile acid. And bile acid helps us make insulin. So for those of you, if your C-peptide numbers were dysregulated in the blood labs that we ran, then that means your pancreas is probably not producing enough insulin. So we want to look at that. Because right now, the way we're eating, our bacteria, they're like, wait, what's she doing? She just ate a cupcake and it's the middle of the night. I have no idea what to do with this. And so don't do this to your bacteria. They need to be part of this overall equation. So let's just go through some of the science and let me help you understand what to do about the hunger, because I know the biggest complaint that I get is, oh, I'm hungry, Reagan. How can I do this? But first, let's understand the mechanisms of hunger. So there's two hormones in your body that's kind of the yin-yang of hormone regulation when it comes to appetite and hunger. The first hormone that we'll talk about is leptin. And leptin is a hormone that's secreted from your fat cells. And leptin lets your brain know, hey, I'm satiated, I'm full, I don't need to eat anymore. And so your brain says, okay, great. Because once your body starts to store fat, then that's when leptin gets secreted and says, hey, we're good down here. We don't need any more fat cells at the party. The hormone that really is going to get you is secreted primarily from your stomach. And you felt it. You felt that deep gnawing in your stomach. That's when your stomach starts pushing out this hormone called ghrelin. And ghrelin is a beautiful hormone because it does create hunger, and it's produced also in parts of your stomach tract, your GI tract, not just your stomach, but it stimulates the vagus nerve to tell your brain, hey, we need to eat fast. So it regulates the appetite, but the other thing ghrelin does is it helps regulate the distribution and rate of use of your energy. So it tells your energy where it's needed most, and it also regulates how much energy we're going to be using. The other thing that happens is once ghrelin secreted, then your body secretes another hormone called incretin. And incretin is released from the digestive tract, but it's one of a series. There's a bunch of different hormones that are involved in decreasing your blood sugar. So it's taking in sugar from the cells or from the blood when your body's hungry. So ghrelin from your stomach tells your brain, hey, we're hungry. And then incretin is what starts the process of taking sugar out of the blood and getting it into the cells. Incretin, it also slows the rate of nutrition absorption. And one of the ways it does that is it empties the gastric process, so it empties your stomach. The other thing it does is it stimulates the liver to release glucagon so that it can actually pull some sugar out of the blood and use it in the cells. So it's kind of this cool little process. But the other thing that happens is once we eat, or once there's glucagon that's been secreted from the liver into the blood, that's when our pancreas wakes up and secretes insulin. Now remember, we want the pancreas to be pretty lazy and only secrete insulin when we're eating, but that's what happens. And then the insulin starts carrying any glucose that's necessary into the muscles. It can bring and carry glucose into the brain. And then the other place it carries glucose is directly into the liver. And then the liver is producing this glucagon. And once the liver has taken it through its metabolic process, then that sugar gets pushed into the adipose cells if it's not going into the other types of cells in your body. The adipose cell says, hey, we've got enough sugar. So now here comes the leptin. The leptin turns off the brain and says, we don't need to eat anymore. So hopefully that gives you a good perspective. So how do you manage your hunger? Well, you have to realize that ghrelin is going to be fighting you very hard the first 3 days. If you can go through this time-restricted eating for about 3 days and make it through that process, you'll do it. You've won the game. So all you have to do is remind yourself, okay, it's just 3 days. My body's going to get much better at this. And the other thing that we're going to train you on how to do in the next program, training number 4, is where you're going to actually learn the foods to eat to satiate your brain. Now, I gave you a hint before, but the biggest thing we have to do is satisfy your brain first. Your brain's hardwired for 3 things: fat. And as you know, the brain is almost entirely fat. The brain's hardware is also protein. 38% of your brain is protein and contains very little carbohydrate, 5%. So most of us, if you go to your doctor and you ask them, what should I be eating? I'm hypoglycemic or type 2 diabetes. Well, make sure you get good complex carbohydrates. Well, that's only going to trigger more issues and create more hunger and more ghrelin secretions, which makes you hungrier and tighten up. But the interesting thing about your brain is if you can get 57% of your foods from healthy sources of fat, about 38% from protein, and then maybe 5% from carbohydrates, you're going to do so much better because our brains, as we evolved, were in a very, very low sugar environment. We did not have access to everything we have now. So our brains aren't used to having all of the sugar all the time, these carbohydrates. So this has led to a lot of what's called leptin resistance. And many of you know leptin, we just talked about that, the appetite hormone. But this hormone is what signals the brain that you're full. and it controls the energy expenditure too. But leptin resistance comes when we have these chronically high levels of leptin because we've overeaten carbohydrates. Now, once you overeat on the carbohydrates, then your body goes into more inflammation, and that inflammation causes this higher levels of secretion of leptin, and then soon our brains just stop communicating with leptin, so our bodies are obese, but our brain is starved with leptin resistance. So the best way of starting to reverse that is getting more fats in your diet. And so I'm going to go through all the different categories of what proteins are best for you, what fats, what carbohydrates. But right now, what your homework is, I want you to sit down and just write out, when are you going to set up your time restricted eating? And are you going to do a 12-hour block? Are you going to try for a 15-hour block of no eating? And then what time frame works best for your work schedule? And then the second question you have to ask yourself, well, do you just want to do this maybe 5 days out of the week? Because that's plenty. That's the research has shown that gives you the results. Some of you may want to burn fat quicker. You may want to, shred up, and so that's fine. You can go for longer periods of time. But as always, make sure you're working with us. Working with your medical provider. If you're a patient of ours in the clinic, of course, reach out when you have any questions. So really admire and honor this journey that you're on of fixing your blood sugar, and you've stuck through this, and you're going to do this. I know it takes some confidence. I know right now your knees are shaking and you got this cold sweat, but you can do this. I believe in you. I can do it. I know you can do it. And it's not going to be easy. The first 3 days are really there. It's not going to be fun, but it's not as hard as you think once you jump into this. And you'll see results, phenomenal results very quickly. It's a change in your lifestyle. It's you taking control over the food instead of food controlling you. So here we go. Jump into this. No more waiting. You've got all the data you need. You're going to have it blocked out. And then your next training session, jump right into it, number 4. Now you're going to learn what foods to eat and how to put the whole diet together. So really appreciate you on this journey. We'll see you in the next training video. Once again, Reagan Archibald. We'll see you next.